So question 16 for chapter 16, the question is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of being the first one to outline his or her position in negotiation? I think a prop for this could be a boxer. Really, not sure everyone's here seen a boxing match, but if you're watching it, there's certain advantages of, going first, in the attack, or if waiting, for the defensive, to kind of parry and, do your own attack there. And I think that's sort of could be a parallel or a prop per se for the advantages and disadvantages of being the first to outline, his or her position in negotiation. You also need to make sure that negotiators may offer you something lower that you will immediately respond and accept to. This is kind of outlined in the reading as well. It's called the winner's curse. That's what it's outlined as in the textbook. And it says, negotiators may offer you something first. You may get excited about it. But if you just were to hold out, push back a little bit, you could have gotten a better deal than what you currently have now. And obviously, some of the advantages of going first is you can prep yourself, right? You know what you're getting yourself into. You can access your BATNA, calculate your reservation value is another one they list outlined in the textbook. Assess the other party's BATNA. A couple things they list out in the textbook as well as those calculate the other party's reservation value. Things are SOPA. Identifying multiple interest. Creating a scoring system is also always helpful. Calculating a package reservation values and identifying the other party's multiple interest. These are all outlined in the textbook, but very important things to remember, when going into a negotiation. And it's really an advantage, of going first, once you go down those lists of the ones outlined in the textbook, to really try to get a first advantage, when negotiating. So chapter 17, question 17, asks what are the advantages and disadvantages of geographically dispersed teams, and what can a leader do to minimize the disadvantages? Obviously, an advantage of a geographically diverse team is you're really bringing points of view and perspectives from folks that aren't necessarily, in your office, and you would have the, luxury of hearing from other parts of either, let's say, the state you work in, or the country, or even internationally, having that team and those views and those focuses and those points of views from other colleagues from throughout the world is really a potential advantage for a company, especially on a global scale in today's constantly moving global environment. Some of the obvious sort of disadvantages, everything's listed out in the textbook, is communication, communication barriers, how things are done, in a certain part of either the country, or let's say on an international basis, might be a little different. Also, there could be, conflict, things of that nature. And also, one of the things they mentioned there is, really making sure you write everything out as opposed to just word to mouth. Some things might get a little lost in translation. You want to make sure everything's very clear cut. You're not using jargon, acronyms, things like that. Everything can be very, very outlined. So obviously the advantage would be you have input and viewpoints from people you may not have before, which can really enrich your team, which is very important. So question 18 from chapter 18, it says, in what ways do cultural factors influence motivation, and how should managers of global operations think about motivation? So that's the question for chapter 18. The first is to recognize that cultures are different, right? There's different ways of motivating colleagues on an international basis, depending on their culture, norms, and, and to what degree. If you're viewing culture, it's very, imperative, especially working with a larger national team. The culture and what motivates, employees is going to be a lot different in Ukraine than it's going to be in Singapore, than it's going to be in Argentina. You have to be cognizant and sensitive of these different cultural norms, practices, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's polite, what's not polite, that might be very different, from one culture to another, and you're gonna have to realize that and recognize that as a manager in these situations, especially when managing global teams. Some cultures are more individualistic, and it's really listed out in the textbook. Countries like the United States of America, for example, perhaps some countries throughout the world as well that are kind of similar to the United States in that basis. And then more collective cultures, so they outline Japan as one. Perhaps some countries in Western Europe kind of come to mind as well, more of a collective, type of situation when it comes to culture. So, again, cultural norms really dictate how business is viewed and how business is operated. There's probably certain things you can do in a business in France that you can't do in a business in, Indonesia. Just wouldn't fly. So, having those cultural factors in mind and being cognizant of them, respectful of them, is really helpful as a manager.